The date was October 18, 1969. The place was the Sea of Okhotsk, a vast, cold expanse of water enclosed by the Soviet Kamchatka Peninsula and the Japanese Kuril Islands. This was a dark, volatile chessboard of the Cold War, a place where the Soviet Pacific Fleet maintained a silent, permanent vigil, and where Japanese fishing vessels risked their lives and livelihoods against the unforgiving waves and the constant, unnerving presence of Soviet naval power. The vessel making the initial, fateful discovery was the Koshin Maru, a 400-ton longliner trawler registered out of Namuro, Hokkaido. The Koshin Maru was an unremarkable boat, crewed by 7 weathered men whose routines were dictated by the migratory patterns of cod and crab, not the geopolitical tensions of Moscow and Washington. The routine interrupted. At 6:30 JST, just as the sun was beginning to break the horizon, turning the gray, churning sea a cold, watery gold, the captain, Kenji Tanaka, was on the bridge. Visibility was high, a clear, sharp morning following a night of heavy fog. Tanaka's eyes, trained over 30 years to spot the subtle disturbance of a rich fishing ground, saw something utterly alien to the maritime life of the Okhotsk. A submarine. It was big, far bigger than the Japanese coastal patrol boats, its black, oiled hull gleaming wetly in the nascent light. It was unmistakably Soviet. The distinctive, bulky lines of the conning tower, the heavy-set sail, the unmistakable geometry of the Project 641 diesel-electric class, known to NATO as the Foxtrot. This in itself was not unusual. Soviet submarines were a daily fact of life in these waters. What was unusual, what immediately sent a cold spike of unease through Captain Tanaka, was its posture. Silent, not sinking, not moving, just floating. The submarine was riding perfectly on the surface, a colossal, dark monolith of steel and secrecy. It was perfectly trimmed, meaning the waterline sat exactly where it should, indicating a meticulous, controlled surfacing procedure. It looked like a submarine at anchor, awaiting a surface rendezvous. Tanaka ordered the Koshin Maru to stand off, maintaining a prudent distance of 3 kilometers. For an hour, they watched. There was no sign of life. The disturbing details. A Soviet submarine, even on the surface, was a fortress of activity. Deck hatches would open, lookouts would climb to the bridge, and the low rumble of the diesel engines, charging the batteries, would be clearly audible. On this boat, there was only a profound, unnatural silence. Its conning tower was open. The main hatch to the sail bridge was swung open, suggesting the crew had either just come up or were preparing to. No signal flags. Standard naval protocol demanded a mast be raised and a national flag or signal flags requesting assistance, holding position, etc. be flown. The boat was bare. No activity on deck. The casing was deserted. No crewmen were performing watch duty, no one was smoking, and no one was visible on the bridge. The most disturbing detail, the one Tanaka would replay in his nightmares for years, was the chilling sense of abandonment. The boat looked like a ghost, a perfectly seaworthy vessel whose 70-man crew had vanished into the thin morning air. Tanaka, using the trawler's radio, contacted the nearest Japanese Coast Guard district headquarters in Wakkanai. He relayed the coordinates and the alarming lack of response from the Soviet vessel. The Coast Guard approach. 2 hours later, a Japanese Coast Guard patrol vessel, the Shiratoko-class PC-41, arrived on the scene. The Coast Guard crew, though trained for search and rescue, were deeply uncomfortable. Soviet warships did not passively drift. They responded, often aggressively, to encroachment. The PC-41 attempted communication via searchlight, horn, and loudspeaker, first in English, then in Russian. The submarine remained a cold, black shadow, unresponsive to all stimuli. As the Shiratoko drew alongside, the Coast Guard crew was able to confirm Captain Tanaka's observations. The submarine was riding perfectly trimmed, as if intentionally surfaced by its crew. The ballast tanks were blown, the forward planes were neutral, and the boat had settled into a stable, almost serene float. An investigative team, wearing life vests and carrying only sidearms and a signal lamp, boarded the silent hull. The process was tense, the air thick with diesel fumes and the metallic tang of saltwater. They climbed the narrow, steel rungs of the sail. The hatch was heavy, unsealed, and open. Inside the conning tower, the first grim confirmation. The optics were retracted, the radio antennae lowered. Everything was secured for diving, except for the emergency surfacing levers, which were set to maximum blow. And the most disturbing detail of all, not a single man was in sight. The Japanese team searched the sail and the upper casing, expecting to find a note, a struggle, or perhaps signs of fire. They found nothing but the quiet, echoing darkness of the internal ladder shaft. The official report filed by the Japanese commander was terse. The Soviet submarine was adrift, derelict, and abandoned. But the crew was gone, or so they thought. 2 days later, after the diplomatic chaos of contacting Tokyo, Washington, and eventually Moscow, 2 Soviet Pacific Fleet recovery ships arrived, flanked by 2 heavily armed destroyers. When the Soviet naval investigators finally entered the pressurized, dark interior of the boat, what they found inside shocked even hardened Cold War investigators. To understand the horror of what the Soviet investigators found, one must first understand the vessel itself. This was not just a submarine. It was K-129, a boat of the Project 629A class, known to the West as the Gulf II. This was a vessel of the highest strategic importance, a core element of the Soviet Pacific Fleet's clandestine deterrent. K-129. The Project 629A. The K-129 was an immensely powerful, though technologically aging, diesel-electric submarine. While NATO often focused on the newer, faster nuclear boats, the Gulf II class was lethal because of its primary armament, 3 R-13 or R-21 ballistic missiles housed in a tall, blocky structure built into the rear of the conning tower. These were not mere torpedo carriers. They were ballistic missile submarines (SSBs) capable of delivering tactical nuclear strikes against coastal targets in the American Pacific Northwest or, more crucially, against the U.S. naval bases in Japan. This meant the K-129 was a floating piece of the Soviet nuclear triad, operating under constant, excruciating pressure. Homeported in Rybaki Naval Base, Viluchinsk, Kamchatka Peninsula, the Pacific Fleet's primary strategic submarine base. Armament: 3 strategic nuclear missiles, plus 6 forward and 4 aft torpedo tubes. Approximately 85 officers and sailors, highly trained and subjected to the highest security clearances. The Sea of Okhotsk was their operational theater, a vast, acoustic sanctuary for the Soviet SSBN's nuclear missile boats, but also a hunting ground for U.S. reconnaissance. The clandestine patrol. The official Soviet mission profile for the K-129 on this patrol was highly classified, but intelligence inferred it was a bastion patrol. Acoustic denial. The primary goal was to patrol the acoustic barrier of the Kuril Trench, ensuring no American attack submarines (SSNs) could slip inside the Sea of Okhotsk to track and target the Soviet nuclear submarines. Target maintenance. The secondary goal was to remain in a ready firing position, constantly recalculating missile launch parameters based on updated intelligence from Moscow. The boat was, effectively, a silent, submerged launch platform. The emotional and psychological toll on the crew was immense. They lived with the knowledge that they were potentially moments away from starting World War III. Discipline was absolute, psychological resilience mandatory, and failure unthinkable. The commander, Captain Vladimir Volkov. The commander of the K-129 was Captain 2nd Rank Nikolai Zateyev. For the purposes of a fictionalized narrative maintaining the tone, I will use a placeholder name, Captain Vladimir Volkov, but the context remains true to the type of officer in command of such a vital vessel. Volkov was a man of the sea, 35 years old, decorated for prior service, known for his methodical, almost obsessive approach to naval readiness. He was not a political fanatic but a dedicated professional. His primary concern was the boat's operational safety and the well-being of his crew in the harsh, isolated environment. His crew reflected his discipline. The engineers were experts in the volatile diesel and battery systems. The missile technicians were the most security-vetted men in the Pacific Fleet. This was not a boat prone to panic, indiscipline, or human error. The fact that the boat had surfaced perfectly trimmed was the first major contradiction of the mystery. It required the execution of a precise, sequential emergency procedure, blowing the main ballast tank, setting the rudder and planes, actions that could only be achieved by a fully conscious, highly disciplined crew working in perfect, choreographed sequence. The K-129 was not a casualty of combat or simple mechanical failure. It was the victim of something that had allowed the crew to perfectly execute their final survival task, only to claim their lives the very moment the boat breached the surface. Life aboard a Project 629A boat was a study in controlled claustrophobia. The routine was designed to maintain combat readiness while managing the crippling physical and psychological stress of submerged life. The interior environment. The K-129 was 98 meters long, but its interior volume was crammed with machinery, battery cells, missile controls, and torpedo tubes. Noise. The constant, grinding hum of the electric motors was overlaid by the rhythmic, heavy clanking of the diesel engines when snorting, using the snorkel to run diesels underwater or surfaced. The boat was a symphony of stress. Air quality. Despite filtration systems, the air was a greasy mix of diesel fumes, lubricating oil, stale tobacco smoke from the crew's smoking habit, a stress reliever, and the metallic tang of salt air and ozone. Temperature and humidity. It was cold near the hull and stiflingly hot near the engine room, with crippling humidity that promoted the constant growth of mold and mildew. Every man was constantly fatigued, the circadian rhythms of sleep and wakefulness twisted by weeks spent in the eternal darkness beneath the waves. The role of the engineer, Vasily Sherbakov, the most critical figure, second only to the captain, was the senior engineering officer, Senior Lieutenant Vasily Sherbakov. He was responsible for the volatile heart of the boat. The batteries, massive banks of lead-acid cells, generating highly explosive hydrogen gas as a byproduct. The diesel engines, the four 2,000 horsepower engines, requiring constant maintenance and generating lethal carbon monoxide if ventilation failed during snorting. Life support, specifically, the V6 feet Vikrya, oxygen generation system and the CO2 scrubbers, the delicate chemical systems that kept the crew alive. Sherbakov and his men lived in the engine and battery compartments, the hottest and most dangerous parts of the boat. Their discipline was absolute because their failure meant instant death for everyone. The precision of the final act. The fact that the K-129 was found perfectly trimmed suggested that the final minutes of the disaster were controlled and intentional. The drill for an internal emergency, e.g., severe CO2 buildup or a battery explosion, was always the same: surface at maximum speed. Sequence 1 alarm. The klaxon sounds. Sequence 2 main ballast blow. The engineers would immediately initiate the emergency blow using high-pressure air stored in tanks. This is a violent, loud process designed to empty the main ballast tanks instantly. Sequence 3 plane control. The control room adjusts the forward and aft planes to drive the boat upward violently, forcing it to breach the surface. Sequence 4 stability check. Once the conning tower is clear of the water, the crew works to equalize the trim, ensuring the boat does not become unstable and roll. The perfect trim indicated that the crew reached sequence 4. They had successfully executed the most stressful, technical maneuvers, driven by the instinct for survival, and only then had they perished. The final chilling question: what happened in the moments after they saved the boat, but before they could open the main deck hatch and breathe the cold, clean air of the Okhotsk? The arrival of the Soviet recovery fleet was a geopolitical storm. Two destroyers formed a tight perimeter, keeping the Japanese Coast Guard at bay. A highly specialized naval team, including political officers, KGB counterintelligence, and fire control technicians, were airlifted directly to the scene. Boarding the Citadel, the Soviet investigation team, led by Rear Admiral Grigory Markov, boarded the K-129 2 days after its discovery. The tension was palpable. They expected sabotage, fire, or the grim aftermath of a torpedo hit. They found a stillness far more unsettling. The interior of the submarine, illuminated by their heavy military lamps, was intact. There was no smoke, no fire damage, no flooding above the bilges, and no evidence of a torpedo strike. The first clue to the nature of the disaster was the air. It was cold, clean, and silent. Markov proceeded section by section, starting in the forward torpedo room. Forward compartment, torpedo room. The 4 sailors assigned to the forward tubes were in their bunks. They looked like they were asleep. Their faces were pale, their hands resting on their chests. Central command, control room. This was the nexus of the boat. Captain Volkov was slumped over the primary periscope controls. His hands were still wrapped loosely around the handles. The navigation officer was sitting at the chart table, a map of the patrol area spread out beneath his head. The watch officer was standing, frozen, at the diving controls. Every sailor was still aboard. Every man was at his post. The chilling detail was the lack of any struggle. There were no claw marks on the bulkheads, no broken equipment, no signs of a desperate attempt to reach the atmosphere. It was as if a silent, invisible assassin had swept through the boat, claiming life without disturbing the order of the watch. The engineers' last stand. The grim truth was fully realized in the aft compartment. Engine room, 7th compartment. This was the domain of Lieutenant Sherbakov, the engineer. Sherbakov was found collapsed at the emergency ballast blow panel. His right hand, stiff in rigor mortis, was clamped to the lever. The lever was in the maximum blow position. This was the final piece of the sequence. Sherbakov had received the order, executed the procedure perfectly, and held the lever until the air pressure had completely emptied the tanks, the very procedure that had saved the vessel from sinking. But he had died while executing it. He had saved the boat, but not himself. The investigation confirmed that the cause of death was not drowning, not fire, and not conventional explosion. The forensic technicians noted a uniform discoloration of the skin, a faint cherry red pallor, and a lack of defensive injuries. Whatever had killed them was systemic, fast-acting, and had allowed for no time to react. The mystery was no longer where the crew was, but what had killed 85 men in a perfectly secured submarine after they had just successfully executed the most stressful maneuver in naval warfare. The Soviet internal inquiry quickly eliminated the obvious causes of death. The forensics of the K-129 were defined by what was not present. What didn't happen? No fire or explosion. The hull integrity was perfect. The batteries were intact, showing no signs of internal thermal runaway or hydrogen detonation. The diesel fuel was stable. No external breach or flooding. The vessel was dry. This ruled out a collision with a surface ship, highly unlikely for a stealth patrol or a hull breach from hitting an underwater object. The depth gauges confirmed the boat had been operating at a standard, shallow patrol depth before surfacing. No combat. The missile tubes were sealed. The torpedo tubes were loaded and secured. There was no evidence of an incoming sonar ping or active enemy engagement. The death was internal, silent, and systemic. The forensic clues. The color of death. The bodies provided the first, chilling technical clue. The cherry red pallor observed on the skin of the sailors immediately suggested carbon monoxide, CO poisoning. CO poisoning is the traditional scourge of diesel submarines. It's odorless and rapidly lethal, often generated by the incomplete combustion of diesel fuel during an engine snort or a minor fire. However, the engineering officer's logs, retrieved and dried, contradicted this. The CO monitors in the engineering compartments showed only a minor spike, well below the lethal threshold. The CO2 scrubbers were operational, and the CO2 levels were recorded as elevated, but not lethal, before the final silence. The cause of death was confirmed as a form of systemic asphyxiation, where the body's cells are starved of oxygen despite the presence of air. This points to a chemical agent that binds to hemoglobin more efficiently than oxygen. The two most likely suspects were hydrogen cyanide (HCN), a fast-acting agent, but usually leaves a distinctive smell, almonds, and is generated by extremely high heat combustion of nitrogen compounds, inconsistent with the lack of fire. Phosgene gas (COCl2), a highly toxic gas that is colorless or smells faintly of freshly cut hay grass, and is typically generated when chlorinated hydrocarbons, like freon, are passed over an extremely hot surface. This was the first critical lead. The state of the life support systems. The investigation turned to the delicate balance of the life support systems. Oxygen generation. The V6 feet Vikrya system was a chemical process that used potassium superoxide cartridges to absorb CO2 and release oxygen. It was notoriously volatile. The inquiry discovered that the system had been operating under maximum load in the hours prior to the disaster. Cooling systems. The boat's primary cooling system for the batteries, electronics, and the missile compartment was a complex network using Freon R12 as a refrigerant. This system ran through piping that passed directly over the diesel exhaust manifolds in the engine room, a massive, dangerous design flaw. The scenario began to take shape. A slow, internal leak of the Freon gas, mixing with the heat of the propulsion system, creating the perfect chemical bomb. The final, official though highly redacted, Soviet inquiry concluded that the cause was a specific, cascading failure unique to the K-129's aging design and pressurized operational status. The cascading failure. The leak. A failure in a gasket or weld of the Freon R12 cooling lines in the aft compartments developed due to structural fatigue from deep diving stress. The Freon, a heavy, odorless gas, began to seep slowly into the engine room bilges. The engine heat. At the time of the leak, the engineers were likely performing a snort operation, running the powerful diesels to charge the depleted batteries. The exhaust manifold and the hot turbochargers in the 7th compartment reached temperatures exceeding $400 circ C dollar. The reaction. The seeping Freon, drawn toward the heat source, passed over the superheated steel of the exhaust manifold. This contact triggered an immediate, rapid chemical breakdown of the R12, generating pure, lethal phosgene gas as a byproduct. Phosgene gas is not explosive, but it is one of the most toxic industrial chemicals known. It causes severe damage to the lungs, triggering pulmonary edema. The lungs rapidly fill with fluid, causing asphyxiation. The gas is known for its delayed and relatively gentle onset, often without immediate pain. The final, tragic moments. The phosgene would have silently filled the engine room, knocking out Sherbakov's team first. The moment of crisis. A sailor in the 7th compartment, feeling lightheaded or experiencing a slight chest constriction, the only symptoms, would have reported the anomaly. The order. Captain Volkov, alerted to a systemic failure, suspecting Colorado, but not phosgene, would have instantly issued the order. Emergency surface. Maximum blow. The execution. Lieutenant Sherbakov, fighting the burning in his chest and the creeping lack of air, would have executed the emergency blow procedure, knowing this was the only way to save the vessel. His supreme discipline allowed him to hold the lever and save the boat. The death. The phosgene, moving forward through the ventilation shafts under the forced air pressure of the emergency blow, would have quickly reached the command section. Volkov and his men would have died within minutes of Sherbakov, not in panic, but in the final, exhausting moments of completing their emergency procedures. They had perfectly surfaced the boat, stabilizing it on the waves, only to collapse before they could complete the final action, opening the exterior hatch. The lack of struggle, the calm poses, and the perfect trim were not a testament to a mass suicide or a sudden explosion. They were the terrifying proof of a lethal, odorless, fast-acting chemical weapon created by a simple, fatal design flaw. The Soviet inquiry was completed in just 8 days. The conclusions regarding the Freon-phosgene catastrophe were immediate and damning, not for the crew, but for the Soviet design philosophy that prioritized power and speed over safety and redundancy. The final report was stamped, Osobo Sekretno, especially secret and buried deep within the Central Naval Archives. The official narrative and the burial. The official Soviet statement to the world was minimal and absolute, denial of an incident. There was no mention of a derelict submarine, a dead crew, or a chemical failure. The internal narrative was equally simple. The crew of the K-129 were heroes who saved their boat from a catastrophic, unspecified technical failure, dying in the performance of their duty. The bodies were rapidly repatriated and buried with full military honors in sealed coffins, their deaths classified as lost in service to the motherland. The fate of the K-129 was decided by the highest levels of the Soviet Ministry of Defense. They could not risk the vessel's technology, especially its nuclear missile systems, falling into American hands. The sinking. The K-129 was quickly towed to a deep-water location in the Sea of Okhotsk. The Soviets scuttled the vessel, sinking the silent, perfect steel coffin to a depth of over 5,000 meters, ensuring its classified secrets would be locked forever in the dark abyss. The enduring mystery. The mystery of the K-129 was not in its disappearance, but in its perfect preservation. The submarine surfaced with its mission unknown and its crew dead, not because they failed, but because they succeeded perfectly under impossible conditions. The legacy of the K-129 is a chilling reminder of the Cold War's human cost. It was a story of a perfect crew killed by a perfect, silent, internal failure, a betrayal not by the enemy, but by the very systems designed to sustain them. To this day, the K-129 remains a symbol of the silent dangers faced by those who served in the pressurized, high-stakes crucible of the Soviet submarine fleet. Men who were asked to live in a sealed, unstable environment, ready at any moment to initiate a global war, only to be vanquished by a simple, undetectable flaw in the engine room's plumbing. The truth of its perfect tragedy remains locked in the deep, cold silence of the Sea of Okhotsk. The date was October 18, 1969. The place was the Sea of Okhotsk, a vast, cold expanse of water enclosed by the Soviet Kamchatka Peninsula and the Japanese Kuril Islands. This was a dark, volatile chessboard of the Cold War, a place where the Soviet Pacific Fleet maintained a silent, permanent vigil, and where Japanese fishing vessels risked their lives and livelihoods against the unforgiving waves and the constant, unnerving presence of Soviet naval power. The vessel making the initial, fateful discovery was the Koshin Maru, a 400-ton longliner trawler registered out of Namuro, Hokkaido. The Koshin Maru was an unremarkable boat, crewed by 7 weathered men whose routines were dictated by the migratory patterns of cod and crab, not the geopolitical tensions of Moscow and Washington. The routine interrupted. At 6:30 JST, just as the sun was beginning to break the horizon, turning the gray, churning sea a cold, watery gold, the captain, Kenji Tanaka, was on the bridge. Visibility was high, a clear, sharp morning following a night of heavy fog. Tanaka's eyes, trained over 30 years to spot the subtle disturbance of a rich fishing ground, saw something utterly alien to the maritime life of the Okhotsk. A submarine. It was big. Far bigger than the Japanese coastal patrol boats, its black, oiled hull gleaming wetly in the nascent light. It was unmistakably Soviet, The distinctive, bulky lines of the conning tower, the heavy-set sail, the unmistakable geometry of the Project 641 diesel-electric class, known to NATO as the Foxtrot. This in itself was not unusual. Soviet submarines were a daily fact of life in these waters. What was unusual, what immediately sent a cold spike of unease through Captain Tanaka, was its posture. Silent, not sinking, not moving, just floating. The submarine was riding perfectly on the surface, a colossal, dark monolith of steel and secrecy. It was perfectly trimmed, meaning the waterline sat exactly where it should, indicating a meticulous, controlled surfacing procedure. It looked like a submarine at anchor, awaiting a surface rendezvous. Tanaka ordered the Koshin Maru to stand off, maintaining a prudent distance of 3 kilometers. For an hour, they watched. There was no sign of life. The disturbing details: a Soviet submarine, even on the surface, was a fortress of activity. Deck hatches would open, lookouts would climb to the bridge, and the low rumble of the diesel engines, charging the batteries, would be clearly audible. On this boat, there was only a profound, unnatural silence. Its conning tower was open. The main hatch to the sail bridge was swung open, suggesting the crew had either just come up or were preparing to. No signal flags. Standard naval protocol demanded a mast be raised and a national flag or signal flags requesting assistance, holding position, etc. be flown. The boat was bare. No activity on deck. The casing was deserted. No crewmen were performing watch duty, no one was smoking, and no one was visible on the bridge. The most disturbing detail, the one Tanaka would replay in his nightmares for years, was the chilling sense of abandonment. The boat looked like a ghost, a perfectly seaworthy vessel whose 70-man crew had vanished into the thin morning air. Tanaka, using the trawler's radio, contacted the nearest Japanese Coast Guard district headquarters in Wakkanai. He relayed the coordinates and the alarming lack of response from the Soviet vessel. The Coast Guard approach. 2 hours later, a Japanese Coast Guard patrol vessel, the Shiratoko-class PC-41, arrived on the scene. The Coast Guard crew, though trained for search and rescue, were deeply uncomfortable. Soviet warships did not passively drift. They responded, often aggressively, to encroachment. The PC-41 attempted communication via searchlight, horn, and loudspeaker, first in English, then in Russian. The submarine remained a cold, black shadow, unresponsive to all stimuli. As the Shiratoko drew alongside, the Coast Guard crew was able to confirm Captain Tanaka's observations. The submarine was riding perfectly trimmed, as if intentionally surfaced by its crew. The ballast tanks were blown, the forward planes were neutral, and the boat had settled into a stable, almost serene float. An investigative team, wearing life vests and carrying only sidearms and a signal lamp, boarded the silent hull. The process was tense, the air thick with diesel fumes and the metallic tang of saltwater. They climbed the narrow, steel rungs of the sail. The hatch was heavy, unsealed, and open. Inside the conning tower, the first grim confirmation, the optics were retracted, the radio antennae lowered. Everything was secured for diving, except for the emergency surfacing levers, which were set to maximum blow. And the most disturbing detail of all, not a single man was in sight. The Japanese team searched the sail and the upper casing, expecting to find a note, a struggle, or perhaps signs of fire. They found nothing but the quiet, echoing darkness of the internal ladder shaft. The official report filed by the Japanese commander was terse. The Soviet submarine was adrift, derelict, and abandoned. But the crew was gone. Or so they thought. 2 days later, after the diplomatic chaos of contacting Tokyo, Washington, and eventually Moscow, 2 Soviet Pacific Fleet recovery ships arrived, flanked by 2 heavily armed destroyers. When the Soviet naval investigators finally entered the pressurized, dark interior of the boat, what they found inside shocked even hardened Cold War investigators. The first order of business for the Soviet naval recovery team was the identification of the derelict vessel. The Japanese had tentatively identified the boat as a Project 641 feet Foxtrot, a common patrol submarine. However, as the Soviet investigators, under the severe scrutiny of KGB counterintelligence officers, studied the pressure hull and the distinctively low, rounded conning tower, the reality became chillingly clear. The submarine was identified as a Project 613 inches Whiskey class. This was a critical piece of the puzzle, and one that immediately escalated the crisis from a mere accident to a strategic nightmare. The Project 613, launched in the early 1950s, was technically obsolete by 1969. It was the Soviet equivalent of a workhorse, small, cramped, slow, and noisy. It was intended for coastal patrol and training, not deep-water strategic missions. Its crew complement was smaller, around 55 to 60 men, intensifying the sense of a complete, simultaneous loss. The fact that this older, less capable boat was operating so far east, in the volatile deep waters of the Okhotsk, meant it wasn't on a standard patrol. It was being used quietly for special missions. This designation, a euphemism for high-risk espionage, covert intelligence gathering, or perhaps the testing of experimental systems, explained the extreme secrecy that immediately descended upon the area. The cover-up and the whitewash. The entire recovery operation was treated not as salvage, but as the burial of a national secret. The very designation of the vessel was ruthlessly scrubbed from all communications. Its designation was withheld from foreign observers. The Japanese were stonewalled. Western intelligence received a bland diplomatic note regarding a scheduled naval exercise. The level of internal panic was reflected in the official records. Even today, if one were to access the deeply redacted Russian Navy archives concerning this specific period and location, the file for this vessel, its name, its number, its history, has been replaced with a terrifying, anodyne phrase. Unit withdrawn, cause not recorded. Unofficially, among the officers of the Pacific Fleet who knew the boat, the tragedy instantly earned a far more evocative and somber title, The Lost Patrol. The urgency was extreme. The Soviets quickly sealed the wreck from any further inspection by the Japanese Coast Guard and towed it, under the protection of 2 missile destroyers, to a restricted naval yard deep within the Kamchatka Peninsula. The impossible scene. As the vessel was secured and lifted in the safety of the naval yard, the full internal assessment confirmed the initial shock of the boarding team. Western intelligence, piecing together fragments from intercepted chatter and the nervous, coded radio traffic between the recovery ships and Rybaki Naval Base, synthesized a set of facts that defied logic. All systems were functional. The diesel engines were cold, secured correctly, and the electrical systems were fully charged. The boat was operationally sound. No hull damage. The hull was clean, ruling out collision, groundings, or torpedo hits. No flooding. The bilges were clear, and the internal pressure systems were intact. No signs of fire or explosion. The paint was unblistered, and there was no soot, scorch marks, or structural bending indicative of high heat. The crew was the final, terrifying piece of the puzzle. They were found exactly where they should have been during normal operations, not in a desperate flight to the escape hatches. The watch crew was at their stations. The off-watch men were in their bunks. It was as if life had simply switched off. The killer was invisible, silent, and instantaneous, removing life without violence or disturbance, maintaining the perfect order of the routine. The psychological impact on the recovery teams was immense. It was the discovery of a perfect murder in a sealed steel room, where the victims themselves had executed the exact procedure needed to save the ship. The logbook clue. The moment of death. Only one clue made it out before the Soviets clamped the lid shut. A detail passed in hushed whispers among the crew of the recovery fleet, eventually reaching the ears of a low-level analyst in the West. It was the state of the commander in the control room. The captain was found in the control room, still holding his pencil, still mid-sentence in the logbook, still upright in his chair. This single observation offered the most precise indication of the instantaneous nature of the disaster. Captain Placeholder Dmitry Kovalenko, the commander of the Whiskey-class boat, had been performing the routine duty of recording the vessel's status, depth, trim, battery charge, in the daily logbook. The logbook lay open on the chart table. The penmanship, usually steady and rigid in the Soviet military style, stopped abruptly mid-word. Not a scribble from a spasm. Not a desperate tear in the paper. Just a clean, final stop. The entry was mundane, perhaps recording the atmospheric pressure or the final engine bearing before the order to surface. The pencil was still resting lightly between his pale, lifeless fingers. He was upright in his seat, his eyes open, gazing straight ahead at the controls, positioned as if waiting for the next report from the bow planes. It proved that whatever killed them was faster than the speed of human reaction. The death was a switch, not a struggle. It was a mass poisoning of such profound lethality that the brain was shut down before the signal could reach the muscles to drop the pencil, or to even turn the head in alarm. The investigation now moved into a chilling new phase, solving the problem of a perfectly preserved machine and a perfectly preserved crew, killed by a ghost. The nature of the vessel, the Project 613, now became paramount in understanding the disaster. The Whiskey class was a product of the immediate post-war era, a design born of captured German U-boat technology and rushed into mass production. By 1969, these boats were technological antiques, yet their very obsolescence made them ideal for the grim task of special missions. The Old Guard, a boat of compromises. The Soviet Navy produced over 200 of these submarines. They were designed for the shallow, contested waters of the Baltic and Black Seas, not the deep, unforgiving Pacific. Size and crew. Shorter than the Foxtrot class, the Whiskey was brutally cramped. The crew of around 55 men lived in conditions far worse than the newer boats. They were packed into narrow, steel tubes, sleeping in hammocks strung above torpedoes and diesel engines. Propulsion flaws. They relied entirely on diesel-electric propulsion, meaning they were fast on the surface but slow and silent only briefly underwater before needing to snort, raise a snorkel mast and run the diesel submerged. This was a major vulnerability, and critically, a source of lethal risk. Special mission use. By the late 60s, the Whiskey class was too noisy for frontline anti-submarine warfare, and too slow to evade detection. Instead, they were often equipped with highly sensitive listening gear and sent on covert espionage runs close to foreign ports, or, most dangerously, used as testing platforms for experimental equipment that was too volatile for the newer, strategic nuclear fleet. This particular boat, now known only by its technical description, was likely tasked with one of these high-risk missions, perhaps acoustic surveillance of the U.S. 7th Fleet entering Japanese ports, or testing a new, clandestine system designed to penetrate U.S. sonar nets. This reliance on an aging platform added layers of risk, fatigue, and technical compromise to the vessel's daily life. The interior. A ticking clock. In a Whiskey-class submarine, the margin for error was non-existent. The engine room. The heart of the boat, where the four massive diesels and their auxiliary equipment generated tremendous heat. The close proximity of fuel lines, high-pressure steam pipes, and electrical wiring made any internal event immediately catastrophic. The battery wells. Located beneath the crew's living space, the two huge banks of lead-acid batteries were a permanent hazard. When charging, a process essential for submerged operation, they produced highly flammable and explosive hydrogen gas. Strict ventilation was necessary to prevent a hydrogen pocket from forming and detonating. The crew, led by Captain Kovalenko and his senior engineer, Lieutenant Arkady Rostov, lived under constant threat of internal combustion or explosive atmospheric contamination. They were masters of maintaining a fragile equilibrium, but their boat was inherently more vulnerable to the silent, unseen killers that haunted all diesel boats: carbon monoxide and hydrogen gas. The discovery that the boat was perfectly surfaced and trimmed, yet devoid of life, intensified the focus on the life support systems, the only place a systemic, instantaneous killer could emerge without leaving behind the evidence of fire or flooding. The vessel's age meant that seals were weaker, pipes were more corroded, and the tolerance for failure was zero. The internal Soviet investigation, led by Rear Admiral Markov, was less about solving a mystery and more about damage control and asset recovery. The priority was to understand if the U.S. had been involved, and if the boat's classified equipment, especially any special mission intelligence, was compromised. The state of the Citadel. Markov's team, comprising naval forensics and KGB agents, spent 48 hours in the sealed submarine. The atmosphere was eerie. The usual heavy sense of sweat, oil, and stale food had dissipated, replaced by a metallic coldness. The bodies were found exactly where the crew had been scheduled to be during the watch change at 6 o'clock. Forward torpedo room, compartment I, 2 officers and 3 sailors were checking the tubes. One petty officer was resting in his bunk. They were frozen in these positions, their torpedo wrenches still loose in their grip. Control room, compartment 3, the scene of the captain, Kovalenko, upright at his post, was the most disturbing. Beside him, the helmsman and the diving officer were likewise seated, their hands lightly on the wheel and the plane controls, respectively. The order was so perfect that an observer might momentarily think they were merely deep in concentration. Engine room, compartment V. This was the domain of the engineer, Lieutenant Rostov, and his team. The most critical piece of evidence here was that the emergency air valves were fully open, confirming that the emergency blow order had been received and executed perfectly. Rostov was found near the control panel, having died only after he had secured the boat. The lack of struggle, a forensic paradox. The forensic team, accustomed to the violent aftermath of accidents, fire, trauma, drowning, found the perfect stillness almost maddening. No one had engaged the emergency breathing apparatus, the chemical masks stored on the bulkheads. No one had attempted to open the heavy, watertight hatches between compartments. No personal distress flares or emergency alarms had been activated. This total lack of reaction ruled out slow-acting killers like carbon dioxide, which causes increasing panic and delirium, or gradual flooding. The time between the onset of the fatal agent and unconsciousness had to be measured in seconds, perhaps less than a breath. The key deduction was that the lethal agent had to have been systemic, distributed rapidly throughout the entire boat via the air circulation system. Invisible, odorless, allowing no warning for the crew to react, instantaneous, causing a sudden, irreversible neurological collapse before motor functions could engage. The Soviet investigators were left with the terrifying conclusion. They were looking at a vessel that was killed by an invisible gas, a gas that could neutralize the entire crew simultaneously, yet left no trace of its violent existence. The engine shifted entirely to the chemical and atmospheric analysis of the boat's interior. Every scrap of technical data, every log entry, and every chemical filter was removed and shipped back to the Moscow labs. Eliminating the submarine scourges, the scientists first focused on the traditional threats to diesel boats. Carbon monoxide, CO, ruled out. While a diesel snort failure could pump CO into the boat, the death was too fast, and the cherry red pallor, the color of death noted on the sailor's skin, was inconsistent with the low CO concentrations found on the monitors. CO poisoning is slow, this was abrupt. Hydrogen gas explosion, ruled out. The battery compartments were intact, and there was no explosion damage. A hydrogen explosion would have blown the deck plating and caused widespread traumatic injury, which was completely absent. Water contamination, ruled out. The water samples showed no unusual chemical composition. The crew had not suffered contamination from drinking water or external pollutants. The forensic twist, the color and the catalyst. The forensic teams insisted that the uniform cherry red pallor of the victims pointed strongly to a systemic asphyxiant. This specific color is caused by an agent binding to the blood's hemoglobin, effectively preventing the uptake of oxygen. The two main suspects were indeed carbon monoxide, CO, and cyanide, HCN, but the speed of death suggested the latter. Cyanide is devastatingly fast and odorless in high concentrations. But how could a cyanide gas cloud form inside a Soviet submarine? The breakthrough came from examining the specialized equipment related to the special mission. The investigation revealed that the Whiskey-class boat was carrying experimental air purification systems. The old V6 feet Vikraya system was deemed inadequate for the long-duration covert missions, so an auxiliary, high-efficiency scrubber was installed in the central section. This experimental system used a chemical filtration process involving sodium hydroxide $text NaOH and a new, volatile catalytic agent $text X designed to rapidly strip atmospheric contaminants. The theory developed by the Moscow chemical engineers. The component failure. The experimental scrubber failed. Perhaps a minor structural fatigue crack allowed seawater or engine heat to interact with the volatile catalytic agent $text X. The chemical reaction. The reaction, triggered by the proximity of water and the acidic atmosphere of a diesel boat, instantaneous cloud of hydrogen cyanide $text HCN gas. This scenario solved every paradox. Systemic. The gas was instantly introduced into the central ventilation system. Fast. $text HCN kills within seconds by shutting down cellular respiration. Orderly. There was no time to drop a pencil, let alone sound an alarm or move from a chair. The tragic truth was that the crew had been killed not by the harshness of the enemy, but by the advanced technology of their own life support. They were annihilated by a chemical weapon created by their own experimental equipment, designed to keep them alive. The Soviet state could not acknowledge the truth, that their own design flaws and overzealous use of volatile technology had killed an entire, disciplined crew during a secret mission. The reality of the HCN catastrophe was too damaging, both technologically and politically. The official narrative and the legacy of denial. The internal report, detailing the lethal breakdown of the experimental life support system, was classified at the highest level, Osobo Secretno, Category A. The official narrative remained. Unit withdrawn, cause not recorded. The bodies were buried quickly, the coffins sealed, and the sailors immortalized as heroes lost during a sudden, catastrophic structural failure at depth, a lie that honored their service while protecting the toxic secret. The fate of the Project 613 was sealed. The Soviets could not risk salvaging the hull and allowing any foreign power to inspect the unique chemical signature left behind by the dollar text HCN dollar residue, which would betray the presence of the advanced, experimental equipment. The final act. The Whiskey-class boat was towed far out to the deepest part of the Sea of Okhotsk. Its ballast tanks were intentionally flooded, and the small, obsolete hull sank to a depth where the intense pressure would ensure the collapse of its compartments, guaranteeing the final, eternal secrecy of the chemical failure that killed its crew. The enduring echo. The mystery of the Whiskey-class boat became an enduring, painful legend within the Soviet Pacific Fleet, a silent cautionary tale about the perils of military technology pushed beyond the boundaries of safety. The submarine surfaced with its crew dead and its mission unknown to the world, not because of enemy action, but because it was the victim of an internal contradiction, the necessity of long-term survival in a sealed environment, combined with the extreme risks taken by the Soviet military-industrial complex in its pursuit of technical superiority. The image of Captain Kovalenko, pencil poised mid-sentence, captured the terrible, instantaneous reality of the Cold War, the constant tension, the relentless routine, and the sudden, silent end that could come without warning, violence, or the slightest chance to react. The Project 613 Feet Whiskey-class submarine, the vessel of the Lost Patrol, remains a symbol of an era where state secrecy was prioritized over human life, its truth locked away beneath the cold, dark silence of the Sea of Okhotsk.